Graphic warning. Mr. Partridge has been dead for at least a decade. I don't remember him much. I mostly remember him as a large, burly man with broad shoulders and a gruff manner. He planted a Christmas tree farm and ran it with the aid of his wife and 4 sons. The Christmas tree farm took up a few acres of land behind the Partridge homestead. Hills of festive green trees rose up behind the house. Mrs. Partridge is the sweetest old lady that you could ever hope to meet. She loved the Christmas tree farm as much as she loved her husband, and she poured every ounce of herself into it right up until the end. She baked gingerbread cookies by the hundreds and kept a vat of piping hot cider on the front porch. The cookie and cider stand was manned by her grandchildren, and the money it made went to the local high school. We have always gotten our Christmas trees from the Partridge farm. When I entered my freshman year of high school, Mrs. Partridge said I could make a little extra Christmas cash working with her sons and grandkids. Most of the local kids either worked or volunteered at her Christmas farm, and I had a lot of fun there until this past Friday when the farm was shut down. The Christmas tree farm officially opens on Black Friday. The mall might be crowded with early bird shoppers, but once they've got the hottest new toys of the season, they would need a Christmas tree to put it under. From sunup to sunset, Mrs. Partridge and her granddaughters churned out gingerbread men, while her sons, grandsons, and everyone else helped shoppers find the perfect Christmas tree. I know I've painted the Christmas tree farm as this cozy little haven, but working there has made me a little jaded. Don't get me wrong, Mrs. Partridge is an amazing woman, and there are times when I loved my job. But as with every job, not every day was going to be sunshine and gingerbread men. The bigger, taller boys, myself included, were the ones lugging the trees to the cars, hoisting them onto the roof, and tying it down. It's not unusual to head home at the end of the day with aching arms and a sore back. I still had a lot of fun though. Most of my friends worked for Mrs. Partridge, and it gave me an excuse to hang out with her granddaughter, Samantha. Samantha was in my Spanish class, and while I floundered and got verb tenses mixed up, she took to it easily and made it sound like the most beautiful language I had ever heard. I would fantasize about having her tutor me, but I never got up the nerve to ask her for help. At the Christmas tree farm, I had an excuse to talk to her. She was usually helping her grandmother with the endless batch of gingerbread cookies, but she would occasionally come out of the house, smelling like cinnamon, to help put together wreaths and garlands. Anyway, the farm was mobbed with Black Friday shoppers looking for the perfect Christmas tree. The crowd was thick and energetic. Parents carried babies bundled into snowsuits, and older kids ran amok, playing hide and seek in the false forest. I caught a brief glimpse of Samantha as she handed out gingerbread men and styrofoam cups of steaming cider. She was wearing a sparkly red sweater and jeans that might have once been dark blue, but were now splattered with flour. Her black hair was tied back in a festive green ribbon, and she was beaming as she leaned down, offering fresh cookies to the small children. The Christmas tree farm closes at sunset, and the crowd had begun to wind down around 3-ish, seeing as the sun was due to go down around 4:15 p.m. I was attempting to tie a 6-foot tree to a Volkswagen Beetle when I noticed a kid for the first time. I didn't really pay any attention to him, but given what happened later, he stands out in my memory. Cutting down a Christmas tree is always a family affair, but sometimes you can tell that the older kids don't want to be there. This kid was maybe 12 or 13. He was wearing a dark gray hoodie and was thoroughly engrossed in something on his cell phone. His mother looked harried, as if she might burst into frustrated tears at any given moment. A wailing baby was strapped to her chest, and she was pushing a red-faced toddler in a cheap plastic stroller. I'm no expert on baby carriages, but I knew that thing must have been a bitch and a half to navigate through the grass and the mud. The woman fumbled with the stroller, trying her best to shush the crying toddler. A small yappy dog pranced energetically around her heels, barking its head off. "Damn it, Aiden, help me with the dog!" The woman's voice was thin and hoarse. She must have wrangled these kids and the dog through a crowded mall before she even arrived at the Christmas tree farm. Part of me wanted to take her by the arm, lead her back to her car, and tell her to go home and get some sleep. There were more than enough trees to go around, and she could come back tomorrow without the kids. The older kid, Aiden, grabbed the dog's leash and jerked it away from his mother, without bothering to look up from his phone. The dog promptly turned to Aiden and began barking. Aiden trailed after his mother as she brought the wailing baby and the sobbing toddler out among the trees. This wasn't really an unusual sight. I'd seen distressed kids and crying babies at the Christmas tree farm before. Sometimes I think the parents underestimate the amount of energy their kids have. Troping around in a chilly Christmas tree farm for hours might be okay for mom and dad, but I've noticed that the smaller kids tend to get tuckered out quickly and get bored even faster. At some point, all the Christmas trees start to look the same, and the kid doesn't care whether or not it's shelfy enough or how much needs to be cut off the top so it'll fit in the living room. The guys and I managed to finish tying the Christmas tree on top of the Volkswagen, and I forgot all about Aiden and his beleaguered mother. We were quickly distracted by the sound of shouting.
No!
A little girl wearing a pink coat stomped her foot.
You're wrong! Santa is coming!
The woman that she was talking to shook her head.
Not to you,
she said briskly.
Santa doesn't come to bad houses.
The little girl was maybe 5 or 6, and she began to cry.
It's not a bad house.
It is if there are 2 men, snapped the woman.
God says 1 man and 1 woman.
No, he doesn't.
Daddy says God loves everyone.
At this point, Mrs. Partridge's youngest son, Ralph, lumbered over to the woman and the girl. What's going on here? He asked, trying to keep his voice even. The woman looked somewhat flustered.
Well, it's none of your business.
Daddy!
The little girl began to shriek, and a man who had been waiting in line at the porta potties darted over to her. What's wrong, Angel? He asked, scooping her up. The girl pointed at the woman.
She says Santa isn't coming because of you and John.
I knelt down and pretended to tie my shoe. I knew I should have gotten back to work, but the argument was just getting good. I had never seen someone get kicked out of the Christmas tree farm before, but based on the way Ralph was glaring at the homophobic woman, it looked like it was about to happen. Excuse me. Another woman was worming her way through the gathering crowd, waving a cell phone. Excuse me, do you work here? She grabbed Ralph's sleeve and tugged. I'm a bit busy right now, ma'am. Please, I can't find my son. The homophobia quickly took a backseat to the missing kid. Now, it's not uncommon for kids to get lost in the Christmas tree farm. Little legs can't always keep up, and small bodies are easily obscured by the rows of tall pines. Kids have gone temporarily missing before, but we've always found them. Everyone's always reunited, and the kid usually gets a brief scolding and a gingerbread man. Something about this seemed different, though. The woman with the cell phone looked hysterical, as if she was in the process of having a mental breakdown. Her eyes were wild, and her blue coat was resting crookedly on her thin frame. She had misbuttoned it. Her frizzy red hair was attempting to escape from the blue knit cap that she was wearing. Ralph turned sharply to the homophobic woman, who was nervously eyeing the entrance. You need to leave, he said. She turned and left without another word. The man holding the crying little girl murmured something about getting her cider and cookies before walking towards the porch. Ralph put his hand on the other woman's shoulder. What's your son's name? And what does he look like?
His name is Bobby.
She showed Ralph a picture on her phone.
He's only 4. He's wearing his green coat and a white cap and mittens.
Ralph took the phone from her and studied the screen. He then motioned for me and the other guys to come over to him. He showed us the picture of the small, dark-haired boy. The boy was wearing a green coat, and he had a white knitted cap and matching white gloves. I want everyone on this, Ralph said sternly, and see if you can get any of the customers to help you out. He turned back to the woman and put his arm around her. We're gonna find him, he told her. The guys and I nodded and darted off into the Christmas tree farm. A large, cold knot had formed in the pit of my stomach. I kept telling myself that this wasn't unnatural. Kids went missing in the farm all the time, and we've always found them. It's easy to lose track of kids in this place, but it's also easy to find them again. I don't know how long we searched. Once the other customers learned that we were looking for a missing child, most of them joined in on the manhunt. The air had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and joy, but was now filled with people calling for Bobby. My voice was hoarse, and my throat was raw, but I kept calling his name. We closed the farm early. The sun sank lower and lower in the sky, and the trees began to look ominous in the dark. The Christmas tree farm, with its neat rows of trees, had never looked so scary before. My boots sloshed through the mud and over slumped down grass. I will never forget the screaming. It sent a rush of ice through my already cold body. I found myself running towards it without realizing that I had even moved. I had somehow known that Samantha had been the one that was screaming. I never heard her scream before, but I somehow recognized her voice. I knew that she was among the trees, and I knew that she was terrified. I ran to her, stumbling over protruding tree roots. When I finally found her, I barely registered her presence. All I saw in the darkness was her sparkling red sweater and matching earmuffs, and of course, I saw what she had been staring at. I had completely and totally forgotten about Aiden, but I recognized him the same way I had recognized Samantha's voice. He was slumped at the foot of an enormous pine tree. His phone had been stuffed into his mouth with enough force to break his front teeth. His gray sweatshirt was gone. I think it had been torn open along with the rest of him, but even though the image of his dead, desiccated body is forever burned in my mind, I cannot for the life of me remember if he was still wearing it. Aiden's stomach had been slashed open. His internal organs had been pulled out of him and draped over the tree's lower branches, like obscene Christmas ornaments. In the waning daylight, I saw sleek red blood smeared on the pine needles. The cell phone in Aiden's mouth flickered. I could see what looked like a cartoon elf dance across the screen. I had never seen an animal attack before, but I don't think this was one. I don't know what this was, but it sure as shit was not the work of a hungry bobcat. I don't remember grabbing Samantha's arm. I only remember running back to the house with her. She screamed the entire time, shrieking and sobbing incoherently as we ran. I hadn't realized that I had also been crying until we got back to the house. Samantha and I must have been incoherent, but her screams had attracted the attention of Ralph. I don't know how many other people saw Aiden, but the police were called immediately. In spite of her exhaustion, Aiden's mother had stayed and joined the search party. She lost track of Aiden, but she hadn't been terribly concerned because he was old enough to look after himself. She assumed that he had found another group of searchers. Aiden's mother was inconsolable. If you're ever unfortunate enough to witness it, the wails of a sobbing mother who just lost her child is the most haunting and unforgettable thing you will ever hear. Bobby's mother was now nearly catatonic. Mrs. Partridge bundled Samantha up in a blanket and poured her a cup of hot cider. I sat in the crowded living room trying to wrap my head around the blood-soaked nightmare that I had stumbled into. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Aiden's wet, dripping organs balanced delicately on the tree branches. I barely noticed the knock at the door, but I had assumed it was the police. When Ralph answered the door, though, he was greeted by an old man. I vaguely recognized him. He lived about 3 miles away from the farm. In fact, I always passed by his house on my way there. The old man was accompanied by a little boy wearing a green coat. Bobby's mother leapt off the couch and staggered over to him. Bobby looked up at her, waving his little red-mittened hands and smiling. His mother fell to her knees, sobbing as she enveloped him in a bear hug. Bobby smiled serenely at her, as if he had merely been in the next room and not at a neighbor's house miles away. "I found him in my yard," said the old man. Behind him, I could see the red and blue police lights flashing. "He said he got lost looking at Christmas trees." I watched numbly as the police officer arrived and began questioning everyone. I remember a cop sitting next to me and patting me on my shoulder. "Son, can you tell me what you saw?" I looked over at Bobby and his mother. She was holding him in her arms as she spoke with the police officer. Bobby rested his head against her shoulder. He smiled dreamily and waved at me, his dark red mittens flopping in his little hands. He closed his eyes. His cheeks were pink and rosy, nearly the same shade of red as his hat and mittens. "Son, can you hear me? Can you tell me what you saw?" The cop was asking me more questions, but I could barely hear him. I couldn't take my eyes off Bobby's small mittened hands. Hadn't they been white before?
There's always a reason to be afraid.